find a way that all the students can participate and have a voice, whether that's working in teams, working in a partner, just finding a way that it's not the same kid answering the question every time.
Hi there, I am Monica Burns, and welcome to the new Easy EdTech podcast episode. As a former New York City public school teacher and current EdTech consultant, I started this podcast in 2019 to share my favorite classroom tech integration tips and stories from my experiences. Each episode offers practical ideas for you to try, share, or save for later. Be sure to check out classtechtips.com/podcast for today's show notes and resources. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or another favorite podcast app, you'll find the show notes link in the description too. A big thank you to our sponsor for this episode, Britannica Professional Learning. They're dedicated to growing and retaining exceptional educators by providing tailored professional learning solutions that help both educators and students thrive. With a focus on activating, enhancing, and growth, Britannica Professional Learning offers customized professional development that supports teachers in building product knowledge, enhancing pedagogical expertise, and driving student growth. Elevate your teaching practices and empower your students by visiting www.britannicaeducation.com and discover how they can help you transform your classroom. This week's episode is titled Must Try Tips for Creating Review Games with Lauren Hawkins, and I can't wait for you to dive into our conversation. Lauren shares lots of ideas you can put into practice right away, and you'll hear about the importance of balance when creating games, ways to structure games, and even some of her favorite tools to try when creating review games for students in any subject area at any grade level. Also, I've included links to examples that you're going to hear Lauren mention in our conversation. She shares some of her favorite types of games, things that she's created and has found successful in the classrooms that she supports. So make sure to head over to the show notes for this episode so you can find the links to all of her resources. Welcome to the podcast, Lauren. I am so excited to chat with you today about creating games to review content. But before we officially jump into that conversation, would love for listeners to hear a little bit about your role in education. What does your day-to-day look like?
Absolutely. So my name is Lauren Hawkins, and I am an instructional coach located in Richardson, Texas. So it's a little north of the city of Dallas. So a little bit about my day is I get to join grade level professional learning communities, our PLCs, to talk technology integration. My specialty is digital learning. So I always strive to work with teachers to look at technology in a lens that goes beyond teacher usage. And so that sometimes gets facilitated through their PLC grade level team. Sometimes I get to work one-on-one, and sometimes I get to do professional learning that supports that vision, or even getting to do some learning walks to see what it currently looks like at our campus to know how to target those next steps.
Well, it sounds like you're in a lot of places over the course of the week, probably, right? Or hearing from lots of educators, talking about what's happening in classrooms. And so today, we're talking about this concept of creating games to review content. And I saw you post and share some things on social media, which is how we connected, but would love to hear from you. How can games help reinforce learning for students?
I think one of the biggest advantages to leveraging games for that content is that you can really target the types of questions and that content. So maybe through those formative assessments, those warm-ups, those exit tickets, you can really know what questions and which different learning targets to revisit to know what to reinforce. So it's really structured that way. I think by offering some type of game, you're really reinforcing or even increasing that motivation for students. Sometimes they learn it differently because it's through a game, or they might just be motivated to learn it differently or even at a deeper level. I think if we can really embrace the teamwork that happens through games, I think there's a lot of deepening happening there, because students not only have to clarify their answer, but have to defend it and then start to build on each other's thinking to say, well, I think this is the reason because of this, or I don't think it works for that. So I really find that's one of the best ways to work with games is kind of those elements.
Yeah. And, we know for students, games can absolutely be a motivating factor or something new or novel for them to explore. But those pieces that you mentioned are so crucial when we talk about, how it can really help reinforce learning for students. So how do you design games that or develop games that really hit on both of those things, right? That are both engaging and effective for reviewing content with your students. I would imagine it's hard to find that perfect balance between the two, really honoring that engagement piece while also knowing that you want that content to be front and center.
Absolutely. I really love that you hit on the duality, that balance between the two worlds, because I find if the game is too overpowering, you're losing track of the content. And if there's not enough gamification, then the students just think, oh, it's just another worksheet. It's just been cut up. So I agree, finding the ways to make that happen. I think some of it comes down to the style of questions that you're using. I think multiple choice kind of gives kids a launch pad if they're stuck, but also because as a teacher, you know the misconceptions, so you know what those other answer choices can be. So if they're picking them, you know exactions like always, sometimes, never. So even different styles of that, which obviously can lean into some of the state and national level testing, pick two that apply. So then there's more conversation that has to be had. I think if you can even build in support structures to make that game effective. So if they don't remember a topic, they're not just sitting there waiting and you're playing whack-a-mole trying to answer all the questions. But I think if you can build in, here's a link to a video that's, 3 minutes, or a link to a formula chart, or maybe, hey, there's that anchor chart on the back wall. Don't forget, it's there for your reference. Or even finding quick examples in other places. I think that can really be of value in creating those. I think if you can also be very careful about the time. I think if it's a race, sometimes it brings in that anxiety for our students of answering too quickly. So they're really not focusing on the content. They just want to answer as fast as they can and hope they're right to get points. So I think if it's structured time, but not necessarily too big of a race, I guess, like you don't want to be the first one because, again, maybe a student thinks differently or is processing it at a different pace. We don't want to punish them and lose the points, because then the motivation drops. So it's really exactly what you said, just finding that balance of including elements to keep the pace moving, but not so much that you're losing kids and they're falling behind.
Those are such great reminders because, when you have that countdown clock, we all feel that way, right? Of like, I got to answer fast, or maybe I don't have time to think about, like, even if we know the content so well, there's that stressful level to it that can turn off students entirely or have them move away from their focus on the content to just the game aspect of it. And, another thing that you mentioned that really I think is so important here and is easy when we get caught up in game design sometimes to not put first and foremost are those support structures, right? We've probably all felt that open-ended question of, I don't even know what I'm supposed to put here, or I know that, but I don't quite remember, like you have that struggle, and you can imagine students of all ages really leaning into those scaffolds and support. And then you're also reinforcing not just the content, but those great behaviors to go out and look for help when you're working through a tough problem. So can you share with us, Lauren, some examples of games you've created for content review or that the educators you work with have created and how students have responded to them?
Sure. So a lot of the games that I use happen to leverage some digital tools just because that's the best way that I can merge all these worlds into one. So one of them that we did was actually through Google Sheets, one of the unsung heroes, I feel like, of Google, called Sum of Three. And so what happens is students are given a set, like a card, and it's just 3 questions, and they work with their teams to answer the questions. They can each pick one, they can work together. But the trick is that the only answer that I check is the sum of those 3 answers. So I don't check the individual. I just let them know if the total is right. And if it is, fantastic. You get a new card, you run back to your team and you keep going. But if you're stuck, you have to go back and review each other's work, check all the problems. It could be 1, 2, or all 3. So now it comes down to, I do want to slow down to focus on my process, but I also want to make sure I'm keeping up. So it kind of has that give and take, but I love the interconnectedness that it requires in terms of collaboration. But the Google Sheets does all the adding. So if you don't teach math, it still works out really great because you don't have to worry about kids getting caught in the math. They're caught up in the content. Some of the other ones that I've gotten a chance to do are some digital escape rooms or breakouts. I like to do those with Genially or Google Sheets. Genially is fantastic simply for templates. It's a great place to get started. You can put your answers in, the links are set up, the game part is set up. So you're really focusing on the questions and the targets that you're wanting to hit and less of, it's going to take so much time to get this set up. But that's always fun because students, again, work on one chunk at a time. Do they get it right? Yes. And then they move on. Both of those platforms, Sheets and Genially, really offer a way to, again, link out to extra resources, or if they get stuck, hey, here's a text bubble with a video to watch or a quick reminder, maybe that theorem or that formula. Let me pop that up for you really quick. So the game kind of keeps moving. One of the other ones I did was called Who Stole the Cookies? Similar to Press Your Luck, which is an old TV show game. Yes. Oh, yeah, most people are like, let's press your luck. But this one is where, again, teams work together. They answer a question as a team. And then if they're getting it right, they basically pick this box and they don't know what's behind the box. So it might be 100 cookies, or it might be a cookie monster. So their score drops to 0. Or maybe it's a cartoon of a toddler. So their score switches from positive to negative because toddlers have big feelings. So it's important. And that way, sometimes it's the highest number wins or the lowest number. So again, the team that's, quote, in first place may not always be in first place. So again, just because they have the highest number, you don't lose those students who are like, well, I'm never going to catch up. So why try? So this game kind of shuffles that around constantly and keeps them engaged.
As you're talking there, my wheels are spinning about games that I love from the past, right? That I've brought into work that I've done with students, and really using tools that you might not even think at the top of your list as like a gaming tool, right? There are plenty that might have that in the tagline or right there in the first half of their website, but something like Google Sheets, right? Which I love, that's a really great option, right? That's something where you're just looking at it a different way, or you're inviting students into a familiar place, which I think is a really great piece of this whole idea of bringing EdTech in. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm introducing all the buttons of a new tool. It might be a place students already have experience with, like Googly tools. So how has EdTech played a role in the development and implementation of games for content review in the classrooms that you support? You've mentioned a couple specific tools and platforms that you love. And are there special features that you're looking for, or things that are really helpful in creating and managing these review games?
What a great question. I find that tools like Genially in particular, with the interactive question types that they've launched, really allow not only for me to present the content in different ways and have them process it differently, but because I'm allowed to add these basically bubbles, these icons that they can click on, and they can see, oh, here's a 3-minute video built in. Here's a picture of the anchor chart from class. Here's a formula. Here's just a picture representation. I find that embedding, again, those scaffolding is really great for my students because they're not shuffling through their papers. They're not having to look through all these resources and they don't know where to go. But again, I can hone in on just that one thing they may have forgotten. But I also like, and Google Sheets, very similar. I can link out to a YouTube video. I think I find what I leverage Google Sheets for is that with the formulas I've been able to use, if they pick the wrong answer, it'll send them a message like, hey, try again, or hey, I think you forgot to add on both sides, or, oh, you picked C. This is feedback I'm going to give you for that answer. So I can really target that. So it's not just you got it wrong, but here's those next steps and maybe how you could fix it. And then if you're still stuck, I know I need to intervene. Something else I really love was Socrative. I feel like, or Socrative. I
say it both ways too. That's so funny. I always say it both ways when I like tomato when I'm talking to a group. I always say, like, I've heard people say it both ways. I'm just going to say it both ways. Yeah, that's so funny.
But I love their space race option, because if a kid gets it wrong, it doesn't send them back to the beginning. It just keeps them at the place where they are. So as a teacher, not only is there this game element, because they're, again, working together, there's no timer, so they can take their time. I have a visual representation on the board showing me how far my kids are progressing. And I know if they're stuck, oh, I need to talk to team 3. That rocket, that bear, the unicorn's not moved at all. So visually, it's a great way for me to check in. But also I can add the element of, hey, if everybody gets past this line on the board, if your animal crosses this finish line, here's the prize that happens. So it's not about, again, first, second, third. It's everybody showing growth today. and that's where we're going to be. So I did like that. And with Socrative, I can embed explanations for answers. So if they pick D, I can embed an explanation. So again, there's that immediate feedback that I can have, and I'm not, whack-a-mole with I keep getting it wrong, and I can just kind of anticipate those misconceptions and those wrong answers.
And that real-time feedback you talked about, right? It could happen with those embedded responses, with those scaffolds and support, and even with a teacher watching the visual, right? Where they can say, I'm going to run over here. I'm going to have that conversation. So I love that it's not just a simple start finish. It's really an opportunity for kids to dive into the content, and for someone who's facilitating this, maybe they're working with a small group while kids are working independently, but maybe they're also working with the whole group as they're going through this with teams. So just so many ways to really be responsive, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. So, you've mentioned some really great actionable tips already. Do you have any other tips or best practices you can share for successfully integrating games with this EdTech spin for content review?
I think the biggest thing, and what's great is we've already mentioned this a few times, is just that being cautious on that time factor. How big of a role is that playing in the game? Because again, if that timer's going, or the games where maybe you get more points because you've answered faster, I find that can be exciting, but it's also very daunting for those kids. Again, maybe our English language learners who are still learning the English language and the content simultaneously, our students who maybe struggle with dyslexia or other different, those different learning hurdles that they have to overcome. Those time games can be really intimidating. Yeah. So while maybe there's a time and a place, I always proceed with caution on some of those, which kind of lends itself into the idea that the game cannot overshadow content. I have seen some games where kids just click a button because they want to get to the next game part, and the teacher has this falsified data and they don't know where the kids are struggling because they were just clicking the buttons. So really having to find that line of, is the game too much that my kids can't focus on what they're trying to learn today? And I think my ultimate tip is really trying to find a way that all the students can participate and have a voice, whether that's working in teams, working in a partner, just finding a way that it's not the same kid answering the question every time. We always have that one kid who's excited to share, and we love that kid, but we also want to hear from those kids that are quieter, or maybe want to think more independently or think at a different pace. So trying to honor all of those different levels within the game that we create, I find is also equally important.
Yeah, such great reminders there. Even just this idea of wanting to make sure we're getting really actionable data from students. And if they are rushing through, or if there is too much of that emphasis on the winning piece, right, you're not going to get really actionable data, which is part of this too. So, speaking of time, because we've talked about the time piece, a couple aspects of this already. If a teacher's feeling pressed for time, right? If a listener is feeling pressed for time and they want to put this idea into action right away, quickly, is there, one thing, maybe one step they could take for a quick win here?
I think if you're wanting a quick win, I found that Quizlet Live has been a really good quick win for my teachers. One, because there's digital flashcards already created, so they're finding a place to get started. But it really comes down to a quick game that very little setup on their end. They literally take these digital flashcards. It could be vocabulary, it could be literary items and terms matching a definition to an example. It could be, here's an equation, find the solution. They shuffle the kids up into teams. But what I love is they all have the same prompt, but only one person on that team has the answer. So again, they have to talk. They have to collaborate. They all have to work together. But if they get it wrong, it sends them back to the beginning. So they can't rush and get too quick. So it kind of, again, finds that balance between, there is a time element of race, but it's not so pressurized. And my favorite is that at the end, the teacher gets the summary of, hey, your kids confused this topic and this topic. So it's targeted to what my kids in that particular class period need to talk about. So I immediately can have a discussion. And it's an instant win. And it was fast to create. It does the teams for me. Kids join with a code, no logins, all the snaps.
That is fantastic. And I just think too, if someone is trying to, maybe they're convinced, but they want to convince team members, right? Having that quick win in their back pocket is really great so that that team member can see this, can say, oh yeah, like I'm ready to dive into this, or I'm ready to take a look at this other thing that we're doing. So Lauren, this was so helpful, super actionable for listeners. Where can I'll link out to all sorts of things for people to find you, of course, but maybe for someone who's on the go and wants to make that mental note for themselves, where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
So I am the most active on Twitter. EDU is what I call it, because I love using that as my PLN personally. So that is where I'm probably the most active. I'm under EdTech Hawk. So very similar to my name. And on there, I do have links to my digital portfolio, which has access to examples of some of the activities we got a chance to explore today. And then just some tutorials on even how to get started with some of these platforms.
Perfect. And I will link out so everyone can connect with you. They can find those great resources. Thank you so much for sharing with listeners. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Lauren Hawkins as much as I did. I love practical strategies, and Lauren shared so many great ideas. So let's make this EdTech easy with some key points from the episode. Find the balance between content and gaming. Leverage digital tools. Create games with different types of questions, and build in support structures. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from this episode, including all of the ways to connect with Lauren, at classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode number 215. A big thank you to our sponsor for this episode, Britannica Professional Learning. They're dedicated to growing and retaining exceptional educators by providing tailored, professional learning solutions that help both educators and students thrive. With a focus on activating, enhancing, and growth, Britannica Professional Learning offers customized professional development that supports teachers in building product knowledge, enhancing pedagogical expertise, and driving student growth. Elevate your teaching practices and empower your students by visiting www.britannicaeducation.com and discover how they can help you transform your classroom. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday edition of the Easy EdTech podcast. Remember to hit follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite app to have next week's episode ready for you on Tuesday morning. Feel free to share takeaways from this episode with friends or colleagues in a quick email or text, or even on social media. And don't hesitate to tag me at Class Tech Tips if you have any questions.